The gray waters of the Irish Sea held secrets that no fisherman dared speak aloud in the taverns of Lancaster. Yet on one fateful autumn evening in 1904, those secrets would claw their way to the surface, leaving four men forever changed and a community gripped by fear and fascination. So, before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. Thomas Whitmore had been fishing the waters off Morecambe Bay for 37 years. His hands were calloused leather, his face weathered like driftwood, and his eyes held the quiet wisdom of a man who understood the sea's moods better than his own wife's. On the morning of October 12, 1904, those same eyes detected something amiss in the western sky. Storms brewing, he muttered to his crew aboard the Margaret Rose, a sturdy fishing vessel that had served him faithfully for 2 decades. The boat creaked and groaned as waves began to swell, though the weather had been predicted fair. His first mate, James Blackwell, a younger man of perhaps 28 with ambitious eyes and quick hands, peered at the horizon where dark clouds gathered like an army preparing for battle. "Should we turn back, Captain?" Thomas considered this carefully. They had ventured far from shore that morning, drawn by reports of exceptional catches in the deeper waters beyond the bay. Their nets were still empty, and the thought of returning with nothing to show troubled him deeply. His family depended on these expeditions, as did the families of his 3 crew members. "We'll try one more haul," Thomas decided, his voice carrying the authority of decades at sea. "But we'll be quick about it. I don't fancy being caught out here if that weather turns nasty." The third member of their crew, Robert Cunningham, an Irishman who had joined them only 6 months prior, crossed himself and whispered prayer. Robert was known for his superstitious nature, always carrying charms and refusing to set sail on Fridays. The other men often teased him for it, but never cruelly. Every sailor harbored his own private rituals, his own small bargains with fate. The fourth man, barely more than a boy really, was 16-year-old Samuel Porter. This was only his 3rd voyage, and the excitement still danced in his eyes despite the ominous weather. Samuel had begged his widowed mother for months to let him join a fishing crew, promising her that the extra income would ease their hardships. She had finally relented, though worry creased her face each time he departed. "Net's ready, Captain," Samuel called out, his voice cracking slightly with youth and enthusiasm. The Margaret Rose positioned herself in deeper waters, perhaps 8 miles from the nearest shore. Here, the seabed dropped away dramatically, creating underwater valleys where fish congregated in abundance. It was also where the old-timers spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. Thomas gave the order, and the net plunged into the murky depths. The winch groaned as it played out rope, the sound mixing with the increasing wind and the slap of waves against the hull. Above them, the sky had transformed from its morning blue to an ominous slate gray, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the deck. "How deep are we going?" James asked, watching the rope disappear into the water. 50 fathoms, Thomas replied, which was deeper than they usually ventured. 300 feet below them lay a world of darkness and pressure, where sunlight never reached and creatures adapted to conditions that would crush a man's lungs. The rain intensified, and the wind began to howl through the rigging. Thomas ordered the men to secure everything on deck as the sea grew increasingly violent. Waves that had been merely choppy now rose in angry crests, sending spray across the bow. "Right, lads, let's bring her up," Thomas shouted over the growing storm. "Whatever we've caught, it'll have to do." James and Samuel took their positions at the winch, whilst Robert secured ropes and prepared for the haul. The mechanism began its laborious work, pulling the net up from the depths foot by foot. It was slow, exhausting labor, made worse by the pitching deck and driving rain. "She's heavy," James grunted, his muscles straining against the resistance. "Must be a good catch." But something felt wrong. Thomas could sense it in the way the boat responded, in the unusual tension on the rope. In all his years, he had never felt quite this type of resistance. The net felt not just heavy, but alive in a way that went beyond thrashing fish. "Put your backs into it," he commanded, though doubt gnawed at his stomach. The winch groaned in protest. The rope creaked ominously. Samuel's young face turned red with exertion as he threw his weight against the mechanism. Slowly, agonizingly, the net rose through the water column, ascending from that dark realm where few men's eyes had ever gazed. They were so focused on their task that none of them noticed the change in the water around them. The waves, though still violent, had taken on a strange quality. The color had shifted from gray-green to something darker, almost black, and the foam that topped each crest seemed oddly viscous. Robert noticed first. "Captain," he said quietly, his Irish accent thickening with fear. "Captain, look at the water." Thomas glanced over the side and felt his blood run cold. The sea around them had begun to swirl in a slow, deliberate circle, as if some massive force beneath the surface was stirring the ocean like soup in a pot. This was no natural current, no effect of the storm. "Keep hauling," Thomas ordered, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "Get that net up now." The men worked with desperate energy now, fear lending them strength. The winch screamed in protest, but the net continued its ascent. 50 fathoms became 40, then 30. They were halfway there. That was when the boat lurched violently to one side. Samuel lost his grip and tumbled across the deck, narrowly avoiding going overboard as Robert grabbed his jacket. The winch spun backwards, and the hard-won progress vanished in an instant as the net plunged back toward the depths. "Hold her!" Thomas roared, fighting the wheel as the Margaret Rose threatened to capsize. "Don't let that rope go." James had wrapped the rope around a cleat, stopping its deadly spin, but the boat was being pulled. Something below had taken hold of their net, and it was dragging them down. The bow dipped alarmingly, water pouring over the forward deck. Thomas made a split-second decision that would save their lives, but haunt their dreams. "Cut it," he screamed. "Cut the bloody rope." Robert didn't hesitate. He drew his knife and began sawing at the thick rope whilst James joined him with a hatchet. The fibers parted strand by strand as the Margaret Rose groaned and tilted further. With a final desperate chop, the rope severed. The boat shot upward like a cork released underwater, nearly throwing them all into the sea. Thomas fought the wheel, bringing the vessel back under control as they wallowed in the violent waves. For a moment, they simply breathed, hearts hammering, rain streaming down their faces. They had escaped. Whatever had been down there, whatever had seized their net with such terrible strength, it was gone now, sinking back into the abyss with their equipment and their livelihood. But their ordeal was far from over. James was the first to see it. He had staggered to the stern, checking for damage, where he stopped dead and pointed with a shaking hand. "Captain," he whispered, though his voice was loud enough for all to hear. "Captain, what in God's name is that?" The water behind them had begun to bulge upward, as if some tremendous force was rising from below. The bulge grew larger, the water streaming off its surface, and then something broke through. At first, Thomas thought it was a whale, though even as the thought formed, he knew it was wrong. The shape was all wrong, the color was wrong, and whales did not have tentacles. An appendage emerged from the water, thick as a ship's mast and easily 30 feet long. It was reddish-brown, covered in circular suckers, each the size of a dinner plate, and it moved with an intelligence and purpose that made Thomas's stomach clench with primal fear. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Robert breathed, his rosary appearing in his trembling hands. Young Samuel simply stared, his mouth hanging open in shock. The boy's mind, still fresh and unburdened by years of rationality, was trying to process what his eyes were showing him. It seemed impossible, like something from an illustrated penny dreadful. Yet there it was, solid and terrible and real. The tentacle rose higher, water cascading from its alien surface, and then a second one joined it. Then a third. Soon, 8 massive arms writhed in the air around the creature's body, which remained mostly submerged. But even from what they could see, they knew this thing was enormous beyond comprehension. "Full sail!" Thomas found his voice, though it emerged as a hoarse croak. "Every stitch of canvas." Now, the men scattered to their duties, training overcoming terror. Sails unfurled and caught the storm wind. The Margaret Rose began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as more canvas filled. But the creature followed. It moved through the water with horrifying speed, those massive tentacles propelling it forward with powerful thrusts. The distance between them and the beast remained constant despite their best efforts. It was playing with them, Thomas realized with sick certainty. It could catch them whenever it wished. "What does it want?" Samuel cried out, his youth betrayed by the tears streaming down his face. "Our net," James said suddenly. "It's got our net tangled in its arms." Look, he was right. Through the rain and spray, they could make out the familiar pattern of their fishing net wrapped around several of the creature's tentacles. The squid, if that's what this monster could be called, was trying to free itself from the netting, its movements growing increasingly agitated. It thinks we're still attached to the net, Thomas understood with a flash of insight. It thinks we're trying to hold it. As if in response to his words, one of the tentacles lashed out. It fell short of the boat by perhaps 20 feet, but the displacement of water it caused sent a wave that nearly swamped them. The creature's frustration was palpable and growing. Robert had fallen to his knees, praying loudly in Latin, the words tumbling out faster and faster. Samuel clung to the mast, his knuckles white. James stood beside Thomas at the wheel, the two of them united in their desperate attempt to outrun the impossible. The storm had reached its full fury now, and perversely, this was working in their favor. The wind filled their sails to bursting, and the Margaret Rose, despite her years, flew across the water faster than she ever had before. The creature, still entangled in the net, was beginning to fall behind. "It's working," James shouted. "We're pulling away." But Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the monster. Something in its movements had changed. The tentacles had stopped their aggressive flailing and instead moved with sudden purpose, working in concert to remove the netting. The intelligence behind those actions chilled him more than the violent attacks had. With a final decisive motion, the creature tore itself free. The net, their expensive fishing equipment that represented months of investment, floated on the surface like flotsam. And now, unencumbered, the squid turned its full attention to the fleeing boat. "It's coming," Thomas said quietly. "God help us, it's coming." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of their lives. The creature pursued them with single-minded determination, closing the distance with each passing second. Its tentacles reached forward, grasping, missing the stern by increasingly narrow margins. The men could see details now that would never leave them. The beak-like mouth at the center of those writhing arms, large enough to bite a man in half. The eyes, enormous and alien, tracking them with cold intelligence. The sheer mass of the thing, easily rivaling their boat in size. "The harbor!" Samuel screamed, pointing ahead. "I can see the harbor." Through the sheets of rain, the lights of Morecambe were visible. Safety, civilization, help, all tantalizingly close yet still so far away. The creature seemed to sense their goal and redoubled its efforts. A tentacle slammed down onto the deck, the impact splintering wood and nearly capsizing them. Samuel found himself staring at the rows of suckers, each one lined with tiny teeth, scraping along the planks as the creature sought purchase. The smell that emanated from it was indescribable, a mixture of fish, rot, and something chemical that burned their nostrils. "Hatchet!" James grabbed the tool and began hacking at the tentacle. The blade bit into the flesh, and a substance that was not quite blood spurted out, dark and thick. The creature's response was immediate and violent. The tentacle withdrew, taking part of the deck railing with it, and then slammed down again in a different spot. This time it caught Robert. The Irish sailor had no chance to scream as the tentacle wrapped around his waist and lifted him into the air. His rosary flew from his hands, catching on a nail where it swung wildly. "No!" Thomas abandoned the wheel and grabbed Robert's arms, pulling with all his strength whilst James attacked the tentacle with his hatchet. Samuel, overcoming his terror, joined them, the three men fighting desperately to save their companion. For a moment, they seemed to be in a tug-of-war with the creature, and the Margaret Rose was losing. The boat tilted dangerously as the squid's enormous strength began to drag them all down. Robert's face had turned purple, the the pressure around his middle crushing his ribs. His eyes bulged with pain and terror. Then James's hatchet found a critical spot. The blade severed something vital, and the tentacle's grip loosened just enough. Robert fell onto the deck in a gasping heap whilst the creature withdrew its wounded appendage. The men scrambled back to their stations as another tentacle whipped through the air above them. Nearly there, Thomas screamed over the wind and rain and the terrible sounds the creature was making. Hold on. The harbor entrance loomed before them, barely wide enough for the Margaret Rose in calm conditions, let alone in this storm whilst being pursued by a monster from the deep. Thomas aimed for the center, praying their momentum would carry them through. The creature made one final attempt. All 8 tentacles rose from the water together, creating a forest of writhing flesh around the boat. They hung there for a moment, silhouetted against the storm-dark sky, and then they descended. But the Margaret Rose shot through the harbor entrance a heartbeat before those tentacles could crush them. The creature, too large to follow into the shallow harbor, pulled up short. For a long moment, it remained at the harbor mouth, its tentacles testing the entrance, its enormous eyes fixed on the boat that had escaped its grasp. Then slowly, it sank back into the depths. The tentacles slipped beneath the waves one by one until only the disturbed water marked where it had been. The storm began to abate almost immediately, as if the weather itself had been tied to the creature's presence. The Margaret Rose drifted to a stop beside the main dock, where a crowd had gathered. Word had spread that a boat was racing into harbor in the storm, and people had come to watch, to help, or simply out of curiosity. What they saw instead was 4 men in a state of complete collapse, their boat damaged, and looks on their faces that suggested they had seen something beyond human comprehension. The local doctor, a sensible man named William Harrison, was called immediately. He examined Robert first, whose ribs were badly bruised but miraculously not broken. The sailor kept mumbling in Irish, words that the doctor didn't understand but whose fearful tone needed no translation. "What happened out there?" Dr. Harrison asked Thomas whilst bandaging a gash on James's arm. Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but found he couldn't form the words. How could he explain what they had witnessed? Who would believe them? Already he could see the skepticism in the doctor's eyes, the assumption that they had been drinking or had panicked in the storm. It was young Samuel who spoke up, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. "We were attacked, sir, by something from the deep. A squid, but not like any squid that's supposed to exist. It was enormous, sir. Big as our boat, maybe bigger. It nearly killed us." The crowd murmured. Some laughed nervously. Others exchanged knowing glances, the kind that suggested they thought the boy was either lying or mad. "A giant squid?" Dr. Harrison said carefully, his tone gentle but disbelieving. "You're telling me you were attacked by a giant squid?" "Not just telling you," James interjected, his voice hard with anger at their disbelief. "Showing you. Look at the boat. Look at the damage to the deck. You think a storm did that? Look at the marks from the suckers. You think we carved those ourselves?" Indeed, the evidence was compelling. The deck bore clear imprints of circular suckers, each one surrounded by smaller marks that could only have been made by teeth. Part of the railing was gone, torn away by tremendous force, and there was the substance that had sprayed from the creature when James wounded it, now drying into strange, dark patches on the wood. Dr. Harrison examined these signs silently, his expression troubled. He was a man of science, educated at Edinburgh, and he prided himself on rational explanations. But he was also honest, and he could not deny what his eyes were showing him. "I believe something attacked you," he said finally. "Whether it was truly a giant squid or some other creature, I cannot say. But you've been through a terrible ordeal. That much is clear." Over the following days, the story of the Margaret Rose and its encounter spread throughout Morecambe and beyond. Newspapers from as far as London sent reporters to interview the crew. Scientists wrote letters requesting detailed descriptions. The curious and the skeptical arrived in equal measure. Thomas found himself telling the story again and again, each repetition making it feel less real rather than more so. The terror had faded slightly, replaced by a strange numbness. He had aged a decade in a single day, and the sea he had loved now filled him with dread. James took a different approach. He became defiant in his insistence, challenging anyone who doubted their account. He kept a piece of the creature's flesh that had been left on the deck, preserved in a jar of alcohol, and he would show it to doubters with grim satisfaction. When scientists from Cambridge examined it, they confirmed it was indeed squid tissue, though they couldn't definitively determine the size of the animal it came from. Robert never went to sea again. The experience had broken something fundamental in him, and within a month, he had moved inland to Manchester, where he took work in a factory far from any body of water larger than a puddle. He sent Thomas a letter apologizing for abandoning the crew, but saying he could not bear the nightmares any longer. Samuel surprised them all. The boy, rather than being traumatized, seemed energized by the encounter. He devoured every book on marine biology he could find, pestering the librarian for more information about cephalopods. He began corresponding with Professor Albert Wilson at the Royal Society, who took an interest in the boy's account and encouraged his scientific curiosity. "I need to understand it," Samuel explained to Thomas one evening. They were sitting in a pub, nursing pints whilst the other patrons pretended not to eavesdrop. "That creature, it was magnificent, wasn't it? Terrifying, yes, but magnificent. There's a whole world down there we know nothing about. Someone needs to study it properly." Thomas studied the boy, who was rapidly becoming a young man. "You're not thinking of going back out there?" "Not immediately," Samuel admitted. "But someday, yes. With proper equipment. With the right preparation. We need to understand these things, Captain. Otherwise, we're just small boats on an ocean we don't understand, praying we don't encounter something that decides we're prey." The damaged Margaret Rose was repaired over the winter, though Thomas could never quite look at the new deck planks without remembering what had been there before. He did eventually return to fishing, though he never ventured into those deep waters again. He stuck to the shallows, the safe grounds where fishing had been done for generations. But on calm days, when the water was clear and stretched away to the horizon like liquid glass, he would find himself staring at that distant point where the bay gave way to deeper ocean. He would wonder what was down there in those cold, dark depths. He would wonder if that creature still lived, still hunted, still remembered the boat that had escaped its grasp. Professor Albert Wilson of the Royal Society was a portly man with spectacular mutton chops and an even more spectacular intellect. When he first read the account of the Margaret Rose incident in the Times, his initial reaction was skepticism. Giant squid, while theoretically possible, were the stuff of sailors' legends, not scientific fact. But something about this account was different. For witnesses, all sober by their own admission and confirmed by the doctor who examined them. Physical evidence in the form of damaged equipment and biological samples. And most compellingly, the sheer consistency of their story despite being interviewed separately. The professor took the train from London to Morecambe, arriving on a crisp November morning. He had arranged to meet with the crew of the Margaret Rose at the harbormaster's office, a small building that smelled of salt, pipe tobacco, and damp wood. Thomas greeted him cautiously. In his experience, educated men from London were either here to mock them or to write sensational articles for the penny papers. But Wilson's manner was respectful, even deferential. "Gentlemen," the professor began, arranging his notes on the scarred wooden table between them, "I want you to know that I take your accounts seriously. Marine biology is a young science, and the deep ocean remains largely unexplored. We have no idea what species might exist in those depths, beyond the reach of our nets and observation. You believe us, then?" James asked, his tone challenging. He had grown tired of defending their story. "I believe you encountered something," Wilson replied carefully. Whether it was a species of giant squid previously unknown to science, or perhaps an unusually large specimen of a known species, I cannot say. But I would like to hear your account in detail, and I would very much like to examine any physical evidence you've preserved. They talked for 3 hours. The professor took meticulous notes, occasionally asking them to clarify specific details. How long were the tentacles? What color exactly was the creature's skin? Did it have fins? How did it move? What sounds did it make? Samuel answered many of these questions with surprising precision. The boy had clearly been paying attention during those terrifying moments, his scientific mind already cataloging observations even as his heart pounded with fear. "The eyes," Samuel said at one point. "That's what I remember most clearly. They were huge, bigger than dinner plates, and they tracked us. There was intelligence there, Professor. This wasn't a mindless beast. It was thinking, planning." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, if that's indeed what you encountered, is believed to be highly intelligent. Cephalopods, in general, have remarkably developed nervous systems. The common octopus has been observed using tools and solving puzzles." "So you think it exists?" Thomas asked. "This giant squid?" "Oh, it almost certainly exists," Wilson replied, warming to his subject. "We found beaks in the stomachs of sperm whales that could only have come from squid of enormous size. Dead specimens have washed ashore occasionally, though never a complete one in good condition. The question isn't whether they exist, but how large they grow and where they live." He pulled out a book and showed them illustrations. "This is based on a specimen that washed up in New Zealand last year. The tentacles were 30 feet long, though they were damaged. Marine biologists believe they might grow even larger." "Larger?" James looked pale. "The thing that attacked us was already the size of our boat. How much bloody larger can they get?" "No one knows," Wilson admitted. "The ocean is vast and deep. There could be specimens in the abyssal trenches that dwarf anything we've imagined. The creature you encountered was in relatively shallow water, which suggests it might have been a juvenile or was hunting there temporarily." This thought did nothing to comfort them. The idea that what they had faced might have been a young specimen was deeply unsettling. Wilson spent several days in Morecambe, examining the Margaret Rose, photographing the damage, and collecting samples of the dried tissue James had preserved. He interviewed other fishermen as well, discovering that several had reported strange sightings in recent years, though none as dramatic or well documented as this incident. There have been rumors. An old fisherman told him over pints at the Sailor's Rest. Always rumors. Boats that went missing with no storms to explain it. Nets that came back torn to shreds. Once, about 10 years back, a fishing boat came in with one of them giant tentacles wrapped around the rudder, dead and rotting, but still there. The crew burned it, though, said it was bad luck to keep it. Wilson sighed at this news. Evidence destroyed out of superstition. But he couldn't entirely blame them. These were men who lived at the mercy of the sea, and they had their own ways of dealing with its mysteries. Before returning to London, Professor Wilson made young Samuel an offer. "I've spoken with your mother, with her permission, of course. The Royal Society has a fund for promising young students from modest backgrounds. If you're willing to study, I can arrange for you to attend a proper school, perhaps even university eventually. Your observations during this incident show a remarkable scientific mind." Samuel's eyes widened. "You mean it, sir?" "Truly, I mean it. The ocean holds many secrets, Mr. Porter. We need bright young minds to help uncover them." "What do you say?" Samuel looked at Thomas, seeking approval from the man who had been like a second father to him. The old fisherman smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Take the chance, lad," Thomas said quietly. "Learn about these creatures properly. Maybe someday you'll find a way for men and these beasts to coexist, or at least to avoid each other." Professor Wilson's paper on the Morecambe Bay incident was presented to the Royal Society in January 1905. Titled, "An Account of an Encounter Between a Fishing Vessel and a Cephalopod of Considerable Size," it was met with mixed reactions. Some of his colleagues were intrigued. Dr. Henry Fowler of the Natural History Museum immediately requested to examine the preserved tissue samples. Dr. Margaret Ashworth, one of the few female marine biologists of the era, wrote enthusiastically about the implications for understanding squid behavior, but others were openly skeptical. Professor Edmund Sterling, a noted zoologist, published a rebuttal suggesting that the fishermen had encountered nothing more than a school of large common squid and had exaggerated the incident out of fear and perhaps a desire for notoriety. "For men of good character," Sterling wrote in Nature, may nonetheless fall prey to collective hysteria when faced with an unusual natural phenomenon. I do not doubt they experienced something frightening, but the transformation of a perhaps 6 or 7 foot squid into a monster rivaling their boat in size is the predictable result of terror in the human imagination. Wilson responded patiently to these criticisms, pointing out the physical evidence and the consistency of the testimonies. But he knew that without a specimen, preferably alive or at least freshly dead, the scientific community would remain divided. The debate spilled into the popular press. Political cartoons appeared showing giant squids attacking Parliament or sipping tea with Queen Alexandra. Music hall performers incorporated references to the Morecambe monster into their acts. The whole thing threatened to become a farce rather than a serious scientific inquiry. Through it all, the crew of the Margaret Rose watched with bemusement and increasing frustration. Thomas refused most interview requests, tired of defending himself. James grew bitter, drinking more than was wise and getting into fights with those who mocked their story. Only Samuel remained focused, using the controversy as motivation for his studies. The young man proved to be a brilliant student. With Professor Wilson's support, he enrolled at Manchester Grammar School and excelled in natural sciences. He consumed every piece of research on cephalopods he could find, corresponding with marine biologists across Europe. In 1907, when he was 18, Samuel published his first scientific paper, Observations on the Behavior and Apparent Intelligence of Large Squid, a witness account. It was a remarkably mature piece of writing, combining his personal experience with scholarly research and careful analysis. The creature displayed problem-solving behavior, he wrote, first attempting to flee whilst entangled, then deliberately removing the obstruction when flight proved ineffective, and finally pursuing what it may have perceived as a threat or potential prey. These actions suggest cognitive abilities beyond simple instinct. The paper earned him admission to Cambridge University, where he studied under Professor Wilson himself. By the time he was 25, Samuel Porter had become Dr. Samuel Porter, with a doctoral thesis on deep-sea cephalopod ecology that drew heavily on his childhood encounter. The Morecambe Bay incident was not unique. As the years passed and communication between distant ports improved, similar accounts began to accumulate. In 1906, a Norwegian whaling vessel reported that one of their boats had been attacked by a massive squid whilst pursuing a wounded whale. 2 men were killed before the creature was driven off by harpoons. The Norwegian authorities took the report seriously, as the crew were experienced whalers with no history of exaggeration or drinking on duty. Off the coast of Japan in 1908, fishermen from a small village told of a creature that had destroyed several boats over the course of a week. Local legends spoke of the Akuro-kamui, a giant octopus or squid spirit, and the villagers performed traditional ceremonies to drive it away. Whether it was the ceremonies or simple chants, the attacks ceased after 10 days. Most dramatically, in 1911, a French military vessel off the coast of Algeria encountered what the captain's log described as a cephalopod of unprecedented dimensions. The creature surfaced beside the ship, which was considerably larger than a fishing boat, and several sailors later testified that the squid's body was easily 30 feet long, with tentacles adding another 40 feet or more. The French Navy took photographs, though the quality was poor and the creature was partially submerged. Still, these images became some of the first photographic evidence of what was increasingly being called the colossal squid or the giant squid, depending on which scientific camp one belonged to. Dr. Porter, now working as a research fellow at Cambridge, collected these accounts methodically. He created maps showing where encounters occurred, noting depths, temperatures, and other environmental factors. Patterns began to emerge. They're being driven to the surface, he theorized to Professor Wilson during a meeting at the Royal Society. Something in the deep is changing. Perhaps fishing pressure is depleting prey populations. Perhaps warming currents are altering their habitat. But creatures that usually remain in the deep are encountering humans with increasing frequency. And what do you propose we do about it? Wilson asked, though he could see the excitement in his protege's eyes. We mount an expedition, Samuel said. A proper scientific expedition with modern equipment. Not to hunt them or capture them, but to observe, to understand, to document these creatures before our ignorance leads to tragedy on a larger scale. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps impossibly so. Such an expedition would require substantial funding, a specially equipped vessel, and permission from multiple naval authorities. But Samuel was nothing if not determined, and he began writing proposals, seeking sponsors, and leveraging every contact he had made in the scientific community. In 1912, now in his mid-40s, Thomas Whitmore stood on the deck of the Margaret Rose and stared at the deep water where, 8 years earlier, his life had changed forever. Beside him stood Dr. Samuel Porter, now 24 years old and barely recognizable as the terrified boy who had clung to the mast. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked quietly. Samuel adjusted his spectacles, a nervous habit he had developed during his university years. "As sure as I can be. We've got the new nets, reinforced and equipped with Professor Wilson's camera apparatus. We got the depth markers. We got a second boat standing by for safety. And most importantly, we've learned from that day. We won't go as deep. We won't let ourselves get entangled. And at the first sign of anything unusual, we retreat immediately." Easy to say now, Thomas muttered, but he had agreed to this expedition. Partly for the generous fee that Samuel's sponsors were paying, partly because the young man had appealed to his sense of scientific duty, but mostly because he needed to face his fear again. 8 years of nightmares and nervous glances at the horizon were enough. The crew was different now. James had moved to Liverpool and found work at the docks, his drinking having made him unreliable as a fisherman. Robert was still in Manchester, rarely even visiting the coast. Instead, Thomas had hired 2 experienced sailors recommended by the harbor master, men who knew the story but weren't afraid of it. The scientific equipment filled much of the Margaret Rose's deck. There were special nets designed to capture water samples from different depths, thermometers that could measure temperature hundreds of feet down, and most impressively, a sealed camera that could be lowered into the depths and remotely triggered to take photographs. "This is quite marvelous," Samuel said, running his hand along the camera housing. "If we can get even one clear photograph of a giant squid in its natural environment, it would be worth all the investment and effort." They set out on a clear morning in late September, the sea calm and the sky a perfect blue. Thomas couldn't help but remember how similar the weather had been that day in 1904, right before the storm rolled in. But the forecast today was good, and more importantly, they were prepared. The Margaret Rose made her way to the deep water, this time with deliberate caution. Samuel took constant readings, noting everything in his leather-bound journal: water temperature, current direction, wind speed, barometric pressure. He was determined that this expedition would yield scientific data regardless of whether they encountered anything extraordinary. 30 fathoms beneath us now, Thomas called out, checking his charts. They were approaching the area where the incident had occurred, though he had deliberately positioned them slightly to the east, in slightly shallower water. Samuel lowered the camera apparatus over the side. It sank slowly, the rope marked at regular intervals so they could track its depth. At 20 fathoms, he triggered the first photograph using the mechanical release system Professor Wilson had designed. The flash powder ignited in its sealed chamber, creating a brief burst of light in the darkness below. "One photograph taken," Samuel announced, making a note of the depth, time, and conditions. Lowering to 30 fathoms. They worked methodically throughout the morning, taking photographs at various depths, collecting water samples, and deploying thermometers. The safety boat, captained by a man named Arthur Green, maintained position about 100 yards away, ready to assist if needed. It was just past noon when Samuel noticed something unusual. The thermometer he had lowered to 40 fathoms was showing a reading that made no sense. The temperature had suddenly dropped by several degrees, far more than could be explained by normal thermal layers. "Captain," he said slowly, "I think there's a cold current moving through this area. A strong one." Thomas frowned. Cold currents could indicate upwelling from deep water, bringing nutrients and potentially the creatures that fed on those nutrients. "Should we pull everything up?" Before Samuel could answer, the rope attached to the camera apparatus went slack. They both stared at it for a moment, not understanding. Then the rope began to move sideways, cutting through the water at an angle that was impossible if the camera was simply sinking or drifting. "Something's taken it," Samuel said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Something's taken the camera." "Cut the rope," Thomas ordered immediately. "No, wait." Samuel grabbed his arm. "This could be our chance. If something is investigating the camera, it might be close enough to observe. Let me see if I can." The boat lurched. Not violently, not like that terrible day 8 years ago, but definitely, unmistakably, something below had tugged on a rope. Thomas made the decision again, just as he had before. "We cut it, or we risk the boat and everyone on it. Your choice, Dr. Porter, and make it quickly." Samuel looked at the rope, at the notebook full of data, at the opportunity that might never come again. Then he looked at Thomas's weathered face and saw the genuine fear there, the memory of trauma that had never fully healed. "Cut it," Samuel said quietly. The knife parted the rope, and it slithered over the side and disappeared into the green water. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, perhaps 50 yards from the boat, the water began to swirl. "Signal the safety boat," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled. "Tell them to come alongside. We're leaving." But Samuel, despite his agreement to cut the rope, could not take his eyes from that swirling water. Something was rising, slowly, deliberately, not bursting through an attack like before, but surfacing with what seemed like curiosity. First came a tentacle, but it did not thrash or reach for them. It simply broke the surface and remained there, the tip waving gently in the air. Then another. The creature was revealing itself gradually, perhaps having learned from past encounters with humans that sudden movements provoke panic. "My God," one of the crew members whispered. "It's real. It's all real." The body followed, mottled red and brown, easily 20 feet long. The tentacles, fully extended, added another 30 feet. But what struck Samuel most was the eye that regarded them from just above the waterline. It was as large as a wagon wheel, alien and ancient, and it watched them with unmistakable intelligence. "It's not attacking," Samuel breathed. "It's observing us, just as we tried to observe it." The squid and the boat regarded each other across the short distance of water. The creature's tentacles moved in a slow, almost hypnotic pattern. One of them held Professor Wilson's camera, which looked absurdly small in that massive appendage. Samuel did something that made Thomas's heart stop. He moved to the rail and raised his hand, palm out, in a gesture of peaceful greeting. "Samuel, no," Thomas started to say, but the young man was already committed. "The squids, I tracked the movement. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a delicacy that seemed impossible for such a large creature, one tentacle extended toward the boat. It stopped about 10 feet from the rail, close enough that they could see every detail. The patterns on its skin, the suckers ringed with tiny teeth, the play of muscles beneath the surface. And then, with a sudden decisive movement, the tentacle released the camera. It fell into the water with a splash, and before anyone could react, the tentacle extended again and gently pushed the camera toward the boat. "It's returning it," Samuel said in wonder. It examined it, and now it's returning it. The crew used a hook to retrieve the camera, pulling it carefully aboard. When Samuel examined it, he found that the sealed case was intact, though bearing several clear imprints from the suckers. The photographic plates inside might very well be undamaged. When he looked up again, the creature was sinking back into the depths. It descended slowly, its tentacles folding around its body, until only that enormous eye remained visible. It watched them for a moment longer, and then it too slipped beneath the surface. The water settled. The sea returned to its normal state. If not for the camera in Samuel's hands and the mark on his notebook, they might have thought they had imagined the entire encounter. "Well," Thomas said after a long silence, "that was different from last time. Back in Cambridge, Samuel developed the photographic plates with trembling hands. Professor Wilson stood beside him in the darkroom, watching as the images slowly appeared in the chemical baths. The first few were murky, showing nothing but gradients of darkness. The flash had illuminated only a small sphere of water, and at 20 fathoms, there had been nothing within that sphere but particles and perhaps a few small fish. But the deeper photographs told a different story. At 35 fathoms, something large and indistinct appeared at the edge of the frame. It was blurred, moving too quickly for the camera's exposure time, but it was definitely there. At 40 fathoms, taken just minutes before the creature seized the camera, the photograph showed a tentacle. Not the entire length of it, but a section perhaps 10 feet long, captured in remarkable detail. Every sucker was visible, every texture of the skin. It was unmistakably real, unmistakably from an enormous cephalopod. "This is it," Wilson breathed. "This is the proof we needed." But the most extraordinary image came last. It was the photograph taken at 42 fathoms, the deepest deployment of the camera. It showed an eye. The eye filled most of the frame, suggesting the creature had brought its face very close to the camera to examine it. The detail was astonishing. They could see the pupil, the iris structure, even the individual cellular patterns around the eye's edge. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien. "How intelligent do you think they are?" Wilson asked quietly, studying the photograph. "More than we give them credit for," Samuel replied. "That creature in Morecambe Bay could have destroyed our boat easily. Instead, it examined our equipment, returned it undamaged, and retreated. That's not the behavior of a mindless predator. That's the behavior of something that understands actions and consequences." The photographs were presented to the Royal Society in October 1912. Unlike Wilson's first paper on the Morecambe Bay incident, these were received with almost universal acclaim. Here was physical proof, captured under controlled scientific conditions, of a creature that rivaled the largest animals on Earth. Professor Sterling, who had been so skeptical 8 years earlier, examined the photographs for nearly an hour before admitting, "I was wrong. These creatures exist, and they're far larger than I believed possible. I owe Mr. Whitmore and his crew an apology." The apology came too late for James, who had died the previous year from liver disease brought on by his drinking. But Thomas received a formal letter from Sterling, which he kept framed above his fireplace. Robert, still in Manchester, wrote to say that the vindication meant more than any amount of money could have. The photographs were published in scientific journals across Europe and America. They appeared in newspapers, in books, in museum displays. The eye photograph in particular captured public imagination, that alien gaze staring out from a page, challenging viewers to reconsider humanity's place in the natural world. Over the following decades, encounters with giant squid became better documented and better understood. In 1925, a Japanese fishing vessel succeeded in bringing a living specimen to the surface, though it died within hours. The creature was 38 feet long, and its preservation in the Tokyo Natural History Museum allowed scientists to study its anatomy in unprecedented detail. Dr. Samuel Porter, by then a professor at Cambridge himself, traveled to Japan to examine the specimen. He spent 2 weeks there, taking measurements, making sketches, and corresponding with Japanese marine biologists who had their own rich tradition of studying cephalopods. "They've been observing these creatures for centuries," he wrote to his former mentor, Professor Wilson. "They have classification systems for different types, different behaviors. We in the West have much to learn from their accumulated knowledge." The 1930s brought new technology, improved diving suits, underwater photography, and echolocation equipment developed initially for submarine warfare. These tools allowed scientists to probe deeper into the ocean than ever before. What they found was a world far more complex and populated than they had imagined. Giant and colossal squid, it turned out, were not the rarest creatures in the deep. They were simply the largest of a vast array of deep-sea species, most of which had never been classified or even seen by human eyes. The ocean depths contained whole ecosystems, entire food chains, life forms that existed under conditions that would kill a surface-dwelling human in seconds. Samuel became one of the world's leading authorities on deep-sea cephalopods. His textbook, Intelligence in the Deep, a study of squid behavior and cognition, became the standard reference work on the subject. He trained a generation of marine biologists who would go on to make their own discoveries. But he never forgot that day in 1904 when, as a terrified 16-year-old boy, he had come face to face with the unknown. It had shaped everything that followed, giving him both a healthy respect for the ocean's dangers and an insatiable curiosity about its mysteries. Thomas Whitmore continued fishing until 1920, when age and arthritis finally forced him to retire. He sold the Margaret Rose to a young fisherman who promised to take good care of her. Thomas spent his remaining years in a cottage overlooking Morecambe Bay, watching the fishing boats come and go, and occasionally being visited by scientists who wanted to hear his story firsthand. He died peacefully in 1928 at the age of 81. At his funeral, Professor Porter gave a eulogy that moved many to tears. Thomas Whitmore was a brave man, Samuel said, but not because he was fearless. He was brave because he knew fear intimately, had felt it in its purest form, and yet he continued to go to sea. He was brave because when a young boy looked to him for guidance in the worst moment of his life, Thomas showed strength and decisiveness. And he was brave because he allowed that same boy, years later, to convince him to return to the place of his trauma in the name of science and understanding. We owe him a debt, Samuel continued, not just for his testimony about what he saw that day, but for his honesty about his fear. Too often in science, we pretend we're purely rational beings, unaffected by emotion. Thomas reminded us that we're human first, scientists second, and that acknowledging our fear doesn't make us weak. It makes us honest. By the 1950s, marine biology had advanced to the point where giant squid, while still rarely seen, were no longer considered mythical. Several complete specimens had been preserved in museums. Sperm whales, their natural predators, had been studied to understand the ecological relationship. The deep scattering layer, where many squid species lived, had been mapped and explored. Professor Porter, now in his 60s and nearing retirement, watched these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was proud of how far the field had come. On the other, he felt that something had been lost, a sense of wonder, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that the ocean still held mysteries beyond human comprehension. In 1957, he returned to Morecambe Bay for the first time in decades. The town had changed, grown larger and more commercial. The harbor had been expanded, and the Old Sailor's Rest pub where he and Thomas had once discussed the incident was now a fish and chip shop. He hired a small boat and motored out to the spot where, 53 years earlier, his life had changed forever. The water was calm, reflecting the afternoon sun in gentle ripples. Somewhere below, perhaps half a mile down in the cold darkness, creatures like the one he had encountered still lived and hunted and reproduced. Samuel took out the photograph of the eye, which he always carried with him. He had looked at it thousands of times, shown it to countless students, published it in dozens of journals. But here, in this place, it felt different. It felt personal. "We understand you better now," he said quietly to the empty sea. "We know you're real. We know approximately how many of you there are. We even know what you eat and how you reproduce. But I wonder if we really understand you at all. I wonder if we've merely cataloged you, filed you away under Architeuthis ducks, and moved on to the next mystery." A seabird cried overhead. The boat rocked gently, and Samuel found himself thinking about that moment when the creature had returned the camera, that deliberate, almost careful movement. What had been going through its mind? Had it been curious? Cautious? Intelligent enough to understand that humans might be more than just prey or threat? "Thank you," he said finally, "for not killing us that day, for giving a frightened boy a reason to spend his life learning, for reminding us all that we share this planet with creatures we're only beginning to understand." He started the motor and turned the boat back toward harbor. Behind him, the water remained calm and empty, keeping its secrets as oceans. Professor Samuel Porter retired from Cambridge in 1962 and spent his final years writing his memoirs. The book, titled From Terror to Understanding, A Life in Marine Biology, became a bestseller, introducing a new generation to the wonders and dangers of ocean exploration. He devoted an entire chapter to Thomas Whitmore, James Blackwell and Robert Cunningham, ensuring their story would be preserved accurately. He tracked down Robert's descendants in Manchester and James's family in Liverpool, interviewing them about the men they had known. Heroes come in many forms, Samuel wrote in his introduction. We celebrate the explorers who climb mountains and venture into space. But we must also remember the fishermen who go to sea each day, the ordinary people who encounter the extraordinary and live to tell about it. Their courage, their honesty, and their willingness to face their fears again in the name of knowledge. These are the foundations upon which science is built. The book inspired many young people to pursue careers in marine biology. Some of them would go on to achieve things Samuel could only have dreamed of: deep-sea submersibles that could descend to the ocean floor, underwater cameras that could capture footage of giant squid in their natural habitat, and eventually, in 2004, exactly 100 years after the Margaret Rose incident, the first photographs of a living giant squid taken in its deep-sea environment. When those photographs were published, they showed a creature that was both familiar and strange. Familiar because Samuel and others had described it so well over the decades. Strange because seeing it alive, hunting in its natural environment, was different from seeing preserved specimens or damaged boats. The lead scientist on that expedition, Dr. Catherine Wilson, granddaughter of Professor Albert Wilson, dedicated the findings to the crew of the Margaret Rose and all those who encountered these magnificent creatures before we had the technology to study them properly. Your testimony and courage made this work possible. Samuel Porter died in 1970 at the age of 82. In his will, he left his collection of photographs, notes, and research materials to Cambridge University, where they form the core of the Porter collection in marine biology. The photograph of the eye, that alien gaze that had haunted and inspired him for 66 years, hangs in the entrance to the marine biology department, a reminder to students of the mysteries that still await in the deep. On the back of the photograph's frame, in Samuel's handwriting, is a simple inscription: "To the creature that changed my life, we were both curious. We were both afraid. In that moment of mutual recognition, you taught me more about intelligence and awareness than any textbook ever could. Thank you for the encounter. Thank you for the mercy. Thank you for the mystery." The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, and we have explored less than 5% of it. In those unexplored depths, in the cold darkness where sunlight never reaches, life exists in forms we are only beginning to understand. Giant squid, once considered mythical creatures from sailors' tall tales, are now known to exist. They grow to lengths of 40 feet or more. They possess eyes the size of dinner plates. They hunt in the deep ocean, rising occasionally to feed in shallower waters. And yes, they have on rare occasions attacked boats and human beings. But they are not monsters. They are animals, complex and intelligent, adapted to an environment so different from our own that we struggle to comprehend it. They have been on this earth far longer than we have, surviving mass extinctions and climate changes that wiped out countless other species. The story you have just read is fiction, inspired by historical accounts but not bound by them. The characters of Thomas Whitmore, Samuel Porter, and their companions never existed. The Margaret Rose never sailed. But the creature at the heart of this tale is real, as are the mysteries it represents. We live on a planet we have not finished exploring. We share our world with intelligence we have barely begun to recognize. The ocean, with all its wonders and terrors, reminds us that humanity is not the measure of all things. We are merely one species among millions, navigating a world far larger and stranger than we often remember. The next time you stand on a shore and look out at the water stretching to the horizon, remember that beneath those waves exists a realm as alien as any planet in science fiction. Remember that intelligence comes in forms we might not recognize. Remember that terror and wonder are often two sides of the same experience. And remember to be curious, to be humble, and to be grateful for every mystery that remains unsolved, every question that still awaits an answer, every creature that still swims, unknown and unnamed, in the cold darkness of the deep. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but occasionally Just occasionally, it offers us a glimpse of the impossible made real. When it does, we must have the courage to look, the wisdom to learn, and the humility to acknowledge how much we still do not know. May we always remain curious. May we always seek understanding. And may we never lose our capacity for wonder when confronted with the strange and the unknown. The deep awaits.